So today we're going to be replacing the heat exchanger on this pane furnace. Very similar to my last video on heat exchanger replacement, except that this is the newer style of furnace. So if your furnace is the slightly taller version of this, then you're going to have to watch that other video. So I'll link in the description to the other style of carrier or pane furnace. But this is the new style, and I actually have not had to do one of these ones yet. This is the first one I've had go bad. I'm guessing the procedure is going to be really similar to the old one, but we're just going to tear into it. We do have a primary and secondary heat exchanger because we weren't sure what we were going to need, and we just decided to have both on hand. But I'm guessing that we're probably only going to have to do the secondary heat exchanger. A little bit unusual that this one would go bad so quickly. We kind of think that it might have been due in part to like the gas pressure or something at the location being incorrect. So we replaced the regulator at that location just to make sure that it's not somehow the gas pressure that made it go bad early. It was running LP, and we found that LP furnaces typically have their heat exchangers go bad sooner than the natural gas ones. And maybe that's because of the amount of mercaptan in the propane. I'm not really sure. If you're doing a heat exchanger replacement and your furnace is still installed, it's actually no big deal. It is possible to replace the heat exchanger without removing the furnace. So I can get at everything I need to from this side. Obviously, this one is not installed, so I will have the luxury of like being able to see easily up in here. But they are set up such that everything you need to get at is on this front side. If your furnace is still hooked up, you're going to have an exhaust and an intake pipe. The exhaust will be going from right here, and you might be going through the top here or here, or in this case it was going through the side here and here. There's actually like a 90-degree fitting that is not here right now, but it goes on here. So this was exhausting out this portion here. The other thing that's not hooked up is the gas line. Typically your gas line will come from this side, but it can also come from the other side, in which case you'll have more fittings. If that's the case, you're gonna have to shut the gas off and disconnect the gas line so that it's not in this cabinet at all. So like if you had a union right here, you'd have to take apart the union, thread that piece out of the valve, and thread it out of the T on the outside so that it's not encroaching on this space. And then your electrical is the other thing that is hooked up, or would be hooked up, but there's just a box right here which is already off. We're gonna remove this, and we'll actually pull these two screws where this box is mounted and remove that part of the box as well. In order to actually replace the primary or secondary or both heat exchangers, we have to take pretty much everything out of here. So that's what I'm gonna get after here. We're gonna remove the combustion blower, burner assembly, all of that is going to come out. So it's really handy to have some sort of extension bit so you can reach everything pretty easily. And we're just going to start with removing the pressure switches here. So one tube there on the collector box, one tube here on the combustion blower itself. And I always recommend take a couple pictures of the layout before you start removing everything. Now, depending on how it's laid out, I actually like to just leave the wires hooked up to stuff, because we're gonna pull the wiring harness down and kind of get it out of the way. And I think we can just leave everything kind of hanging off to the side. Things with Molex plugs like this combustion blower, it's just simpler to unplug that. The limit switch back here, I don't think we actually have to pull that out, so we can just unplug it. The burner box, we can take that off next. There's just 4 screws in here. And you want to be really careful to not bump or touch this. That's the igniter. They do tend to be pretty fragile. It's also a good time to inspect the burners. And while you have this out of here, it's also great to clean this flame sensor. You can just use a piece of emery paper and brush that up, get it all shiny, because that's actually a conductive connection. As the flame crosses it, flames are conductive, and it'll send a voltage out on this probe, and the board will read that as a milliamp draw. And set this down here, out of the way. Now I can remove the combustion blower. Now these are a fine thread screw, so you got to keep them separate. When you put them back in, don't use the impact because you don't want to cross thread them. See how they're kind of finer. And we'll just leave this piece of tubing on the combustion blower. Remove it from the collector box and the condensate trap. And if you remove this condensate trap, then you're supposed to replace the gasket, from what I understand. So we're gonna just try to leave that on the collector box portion itself. This is different from the older generation of carrier furnaces where this black part is actually attached to the heat exchanger. This is a separate part. We have to take this off and just wash it out in some warm water. I've already got the condensate disconnected. That's another thing that you would have to disconnect separately. If your furnace is still installed on the house, there would be condensate fitting attached there somehow. We'll go ahead and remove these screws. Uh-oh. That one doesn't want to come out. That is an interesting screw. Look at that. It's got like a long stud and then like a zip screw on the end. Hard to get those confused. I don't like how those aren't pulling out. Large percentage of those are not coming out. Since we do actually have an extra gasket right up there, we're going to go ahead and remove this, and then we'll just move that new gasket that's up there down to here. Because if you do remove this, they do recommend that you replace that gasket. But that's obviously up to your discretion. If you put it back on and it doesn't seem to be leaking or anything, then you're probably okay. It's just what they recommend. So I'm having a little trouble getting these screws to actually start coming out, which could be a sign that they've rusted out badly down at this part. Ouch. It took me a minute, but I did just have to apply pressure from this side while running those screws out. And they did come out. They're not very rusty, so I'm not sure why they were so troublesome there. You can see they want us to take this piece then and wash it with some hot water and just get rid of all the crusty stuff. And then this gasket, I believe, is going to be replaced, so you don't have to worry about saving that. There's our actual secondary heat exchanger. And you can see it does have a bunch of debris clogging it up. But it appears to be made out of a stainless steel, so I don't know why. Some sort of incomplete combustion still ate the heat exchanger, so look at that. Look how plugged up that is. Doesn't look like the old ones were plugged up with like rust, but this is just like, it just looks like dirt. It's kind of weird. In any case, we will proceed. We're ready to start removing the screws that actually hold this piece in. Now, depending on your ductwork might infringe on this. You can see the ductwork on this one was silicone right here, but usually you can just take out these couple of screws and kind of pry this up a little bit to give yourself a little extra clearance. I'm going to have the luxury of just taking it completely off, so I'll probably just do that here. That'll just give us a little more space for sliding this piece out. But if you do have to just flex it up at the end, it's really not that big a deal. And then I like to put the screws all just on a piece of cardboard in their separate pile. If they're special screws, special lengths or something, sometimes I'll mark what they are. But I just know these fine thread ones are for the condensate trap and the combustion blower. These ones are for the pressure switch and the burner box, and these ones are for the collector box. If you look down on the inside of the furnace, you can see there's a support rib going all the way down on both sides. So it's just this row of screws that has to be removed. There's like a separate bracket right here, and we have to remove this entire bracket in order to get this out. And thankfully, I think that gives us enough clearance that we don't have to remove the entire wiring harness. Make this piece loose here. Oh, missed one screw. If it's not coming out, just re-examine. You might have missed a screw. On the old furnace, we actually had to remove a couple of screws up from the bottom, but it looks like on this style you don't have to do that, which is actually quite nice. And it leaves enough clearance that I think this will be fine coming out. With the old one, sometimes this was a little iffy. This part's really, it's pretty sharp, so it's good to get some gloves. By removing this support rib on the front, should give us a little bit of extra room for the wires. Obviously we don't want to cut or damage the wires, so I'm just going to slip a piece of cardboard in between the wires in there. I'm going to remove these screws on the side so that this can drop down just a little bit, because it seems really tight going over that wiring harness. This will just allow us to flex that down a little bit and make it a lot easier to slide this thing out. Here we go. Now I can show you how this actually drops in there. On the old ones, I keep comparing it to the old ones because I'm just so much more familiar with the old ones. But the old ones actually have a tab that drops in on a piece back here. But you can see this one has a whole slide rail built into it, kind of similar to how your combustion or your main blowers slide in. You can see right back here where it was leaking. And if we look at the back side of this, bad right along there. So we don't need this gasket. Just carefully peel that off because there's a new one. So it is actually a good idea to just pull this limit switch, because if you accidentally tip the furnace onto the limit switch, you could damage it. In theory it's protected because of these lips on the edges of the furnace there, but I'm just going to take it off preemptively so I don't damage it. I think I did break one of these once a long time ago. Once you have this out of here, you can tip it up like that. All that stuff dumping out of it, that's what caused it to start sooting up like crazy. They want us to remove the coupling box, and then I like to keep all these screws from the heat exchanger part separate. They usually send new ones with it, so I don't mix them up with the other screws that we already took out of the furnace. That was not very stuck at all. Ready to see how it looks in there? Me too. Oofda. So it's very specifically these two on this side that were having the issue, so that's really weird. That this appears to be kind of eating away at the primary heat exchanger. Makes me kind of think that we're gonna just replace the primary heat exchanger as well as a secondary heat exchanger. If this was all in fine shape, it'd probably be fine to just leave it, but I think it's probably gonna start leaking. And it's better to just do both at the same time if you think it's gonna be a problem. So we've got 3 screws along here, and these are the ones that are always really difficult to remove. Oh yeah. Lucky day. We got that one out, and that one was the one that looked the worst. Yeah, usually these are really terrible to get out, but that's really lucky that I got all those out without any trouble. So you'll probably have to suffer a while longer removing those. You usually end up having to use like a torch and a vice grip. Just gently pry up right there. And there's a separate piece right on here. And if they did not send us a new one, then we're gonna have to reuse this piece. Kind of want to remove it either way though, just so I can show you what the heat exchanger looks like, and we can kind of analyze their design, see if we like it. Oofda. There's that piece off. So you can see like they had some rust dropping off of the primary heat exchanger right here where this edge is rolled over. There was some contamination like fiberglass, and then it appears that these ones kind of blocked up first. Once these blocked up, just didn't have the right airflow through, and it began sooting, and then the whole thing just sooted up. So again, because of the damage I'm seeing here, we are just going to go ahead and replace the primary heat exchanger as well as the secondary. So very much a bummer, because like you can see all these upper ones, these were still burning really well. These were not the problem. It's like these lower ones. It almost seems like if they like made the collector box on this part deeper so that any of this debris that ends up falling down in there could get trapped where it doesn't affect the airflow. I wonder if that would help increase the lifespan of these. But I'm not the engineer, so we're just gonna proceed. So since we took out this screw for this panel and this panel as well, when I went around the outside, it's gonna be a little floppy, but we're gonna go ahead and flip the thing over. We'll just start by undoing the secondary here. So there's the secondary heat exchanger removed. So sad because it's stainless steel, but it's just plugged up with junk. Whoops, just bent the fins on it. So be really careful handling your new ones. If you do that, then you'll be a little bit sad. So the new one does come with this piece, and in shipping sometimes these little pieces kind of fall out, so make sure that they're all seated properly. There's a lot of oil on this. We're gonna remove this gasket here. Because there's already a new fiberglass gasket right there, so just be really careful when you drop that on. Now, we're gonna continue with removing the primary heat exchanger. So we have to remove all the screws on the top here. Actually, just lift it off. And it comes with a new piece of fiberglass for right here, so don't worry about this piece. It does kind of look like it was starting to leak right here. So again, I'm thinking it is a good thing that we're just gonna replace this preemptively. So here's that new piece of fiberglass. It's gonna go right back here. And it looks like we will actually have to remove these two screws in order to get that piece of fiberglass back there. So just pull that old piece out. And since we're doing both primary and secondary, before we put this row of screws in, we actually need to get this piece of foam dropped in here properly. And I'll show you, there's actually a couple of notches here that this has a couple spots for those to drop into. So if we set this on here, you'll see all the holes line up perfectly. So we'll just drop those two notches in very carefully so as to not mess up the insulation. We will then slide this piece in, and we got to watch the gasket on here as well as this goes in. And we should be totally good to do the baffle screws there as well. That over till it lines up. There we go. Now I'm going to bring the new secondary heat exchanger or primary heat exchanger over. Here's how that looks. And this side is going to go down for now. With all that screwed back in, we can now flip this assembly over very carefully. And just like on the old one, there's a little bit of insulation right here. I would just recommend pulling that off because you don't want that dropping down into here and plugging this up. And one of our flutes did fall out, so we're just going to stick that back in carefully. You don't want those going missing on us. So on this side here, we have this piece, which has the gasket that is going to seal against the edge of this piece. Everything's a little bit bent up, almost like it had kind of a hard time in shipping, so we'll just have to pay extra close attention to how it goes together. But I'm going to get a rag so that I can wipe this oily stuff off, and we'll actually have to put a layer of sealant onto this piece or onto this piece, and then drop this in place right here, overlap it on here, and then we'll be able to put in those screws that were right here that were super rusty. But then the screws around the outside are going to have the new box right here. Will actually go over top of all of these and have to go through both layers. We'll have to put sealant on here all the way around. They want one of them to be a low adhesion and one of them to be a high adhesion. This one they want to be a high adhesion, and this one they wanted a lower adhesion. So they actually recommend putting like a cooking oil on it. I guess in theory you could take this off at some point, but I found the silicone isn't really that hard to remove, so my fix for that is we just won't clean the oil off as well on this piece, and it should automatically make it a low adhesion because there's actually a pretty thick coating of some sort of oil or grease on there already. Carefully wipe down these surfaces here, and we'll stick this screwdriver in here to give us a little clearance from that. Then we'll go ahead with our high temp silicone here, and we don't want to put so much that it's gonna squeeze out and block off anything in the heat exchanger, so try to have it a little bit heavier toward the outside than toward the inside, but definitely go over the screw holes so that there's some silicone on either side of the screw hole, because of course we don't want it leaking. So just very carefully make sure there's no excess toward the inside. I don't like how like loose those are. It's kind of weird, but this is kind of the way that most of the modern furnaces have gone. We can carefully overlap this just like so, and we're only going to put in these 3 new screws. Now our next piece is going to go on right here, so we'll just carefully wipe down that exposed silicone path. Usually if these things have a heat exchanger replaced once, they're not going to have another one replaced because the first one is under warranty, and then after that you have to buy it yourself, and it just makes more sense to buy a new furnace. A lot of people comment on the other video and ask like, why would you put a new heat exchanger in? And the answer to that is the only time we pretty much recommend putting in a new heat exchanger is if the unit has it under warranty. Otherwise we usually don't recommend it. We'll carefully spread this thin layer. We don't want to be super heavy toward the inside because we don't want it to possibly get in there and block off any of the baffles. This plate right here, if you decide to reuse the old one, it's not that big a deal. It is stainless, so you can just clean it up and reuse it, but we're just going to use the new one here. Very carefully line everything up. I'm not going to go all the way tight at first, just to kind of make sure. Well, that one I went all the way tight, but just to kind of make sure that everything is lining up properly. We're going to just take it slow. This particular screw in the corner is going into the baffle. and through that piece in there and through this plate. So you have to get 3 holes lined up. And this piece here actually has to go on before we can do these top ones. So don't forget about that piece. Now everything's lining up good, so we're just gonna send them all home. And I like the amount of silicone I'm seeing, just squeezing out a little bit, but not too excessive. Somehow magically grabbed exactly the right number of screws. Since it's common for them to leak on this bottom edge here, I think it's a good idea to just run a little extra high temp silicone just into this crack right here. Because once it starts leaking, it will start eating away the metals. So that's the primary and secondary out, and the primary and secondary put back together. Just examine this one more time. Just cut those gaskets out. Very strange. So they actually have holes cut out for the screws to go through, but if you look at how they have their gaskets installed, the gaskets are not where the holes are. So I don't know if that's just a factory quality control issue, but look at that. We'll put these new ones on over the holes, which just seems to make more sense. Alright, now as we run this heat exchanger in, we just have to get this rail right here to slide into these spots on here. Gotta really watch the wiring harness. Again, as we slide this in, maybe we'll stick our piece of cardboard back in there. All right, seems to be sitting home nicely now. So at this point, basically just start reinstalling all the stuff that we took out. Here's that new gasket. Oh, I actually got to go get the collector box. It should be dry now. So the collector box is good, clean, and dry. You can see they have these little cutouts to help you align it properly. You can see that's incorrect, so we got to flip it this way. There and there. So once you know which direction it has to go on, the sticky part gets applied to the collector box. So we're just going to go like this. Make sure it lines up with all the holes. And they don't say to do this, but I found that these leak really easily, so I like to have a slight bit of adhesion on here. So I'm just going to do this because I do not like coming back and replacing the gasket in 3 years. So if you're really careful, you can go ahead and pull this old gasket off like that. And because it has 2 spots the condensate trap can actually be hooked to, you can carefully remove it from this side here. And install it down here if your kit did not come with a new gasket, which mine did not. So that's what we're going to do right here. Since they do want you to replace that gasket if you take the condensate trap off. Just like that. Now we can go ahead and actually put this in here. And then they actually send a new style of screw for putting the collector box back on. Evidently they decided that the other style is not so good. So we're not going to put those back in, and instead we're going to use these. These are only supposed to be tightened to 21 inch-pounds, so we're just going to tighten them by hand. Get them all set to 21 inch-pounds. Now it's just a matter of reassembling everything. Don't forget you've got a fine thread screw here. For tightening in the screws on the collector box, they do want you to do that in an alternating pattern because they want it to pull down evenly. They don't want you to just go crazy on one side and have it, over torque. Next we can lay the combustion blower in here, and we're going to be using our fine thread screws for this. After we get all those screws in, we can hook our piece of tubing up right here, and we can plug this inducer back in. Swing the burner assembly back up around. Oh yeah, I said we were going to maybe clean this flame sensor. So you can use, for cleaning the flame sensor, you can either use a wire brush like this, it takes a little bit longer, or you can use some emery paper, which is a type of sandpaper, but since we've got it opened up and it's really easy to get to, we can just clean it quick. Then you can also brush the burners and make sure that they're clean, but just do not clean the the igniter. Don't want to clean that. Okay, that should be good. Now we can plug stuff back in. We just have this limit switch back here that we unplugged. That's all still plugged in. And lastly, our pressure switch, which this back one hooks onto the combustion blower right there. And this one goes over to this nipple on the collector box. Very hard to see, but... And these ones are threading into plastic, so we got to be really careful to not over torque them. So as you can see, doing this does kind of make a big mess. So there's all the old parts that are going to be sent back for warranty, and here's the furnace all put back together. Should be good to go on this one. I will link in the description to the video where I do it on the older style carrier furnace. Carrier and pane are the same procedure. So I'll link to that in the description, and I'll also link to a time lapse of me replacing one out on the job. On the job, it's just a little bit harder to do any recording while you're working on stuff, but this is just a furnace that we're gonna use for a shop project here, so thought I would record the process. I'll also try to link to some of the tools that I find pretty helpful for jobs like this. So there it is, all put back together and my tools cleaned up. Hopefully it will last a good bit longer. It's basically brand new at this point. I wanted to say too, pretty much the only time it makes sense to replace the primary and secondary heat exchanger on a furnace is if they're covered under warranty, because you're still going to spend quite a bit in labor, and it's very likely you won't get as much time out of the second primary and secondary heat exchanger, just because usually the system will start sooting up kind of within 5 years of putting the new one in. I don't really know why that is, but that's kind of what I've seen. Even after like adjusting gas pressures and everything, it seems like they just don't last as long when it's the second heat exchanger. It's an option that you can do, but probably it's better to just upgrade the system if the heat exchanger ends up going bad. Anyway, hope that you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys later.